Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's conversation topic is all about surveys and how to build successful consultations. We will aim to keep this session fairly short and as practical as possible. We'll therefore be together for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on how many questions we get. We'll start with a quick round of introductions, and then I will hand over to Fraser for his presentation. There'll be plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of the session as well. Just before we do those introductions, a couple of housekeeping rules. First of all, the session will be recorded. We will share the recording with all of those who registered either later this week or early next week. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen that you can use. Otherwise, post them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that as well as we go through the webinar. Again, we'll address all of the questions at the end, so we'll just let Fraser do his presentation, and then we'll get back to all of your questions. Now, some of you are joining us for the first time. I can also recognize some of our clients. Some of you may still know us as Citizen Lab. In fact, we rebranded on the 4th of June to Go Vocal. It is very much only a change in name and visual identity. We are still the same team, as you can see, still the same product, essentially a one-stop hub digital engagement platform that enables you to engage residents in a number of different ways. And one of those ways to engage residents is surveys, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague Fraser. For those of you who already work with us, you will know him as your government success manager, so your main point of contact at Go Vocal, who supports you day in and day out, both with technical implementation and more sort of strategic advice as well. For those of you who don't work with us yet, this is the person who would be supporting you on a day-to-day basis. So Fraser, over to you for a short introduction, and then if you like, just kick off with your presentation and get started.
Thanks, Laura. So as you just heard, my name is Fraser. I'm the Gov Success Manager here at Go Vocal. But got to be careful not to say Citizen Lab, UK and Ireland. I have spent pretty much my whole career looking at consultation and engagement and reviewing, in fact, people's consultations. So a lot of the content today is based on my observation experience, but also some research that I've come across. We have got quite a lot of content, so I'm going to talk to you for at least 20 minutes, and then I think we've got roughly 10 minutes of Q&A. So be curious, ask questions, use the chat, and let's explore designing better surveys. So what do we have in store? Well, we've got these 4 points really to cover. We're going to give you some context about the method, what's good, what's bad, and importantly, why it's got a new lease of life. I'm then going to talk about effective survey design. So that's really the good practice. And then I'm going to highlight some mistakes, some of the bad practice. And that's really how I learn. So I think that's an important section. And of course, how to avoid those bad practices. And then we will go on to Q&A. So, why are surveys still relevant? Why do they still matter? Surveys got a lot of bad rep, because we always talk about, doing things differently. But then the bread and butter of many consultations, in the UK at least, is still the survey. That could be a street survey, it could be an online survey, it could be a paper survey, it might be a very structured survey where you've got set questions, it might even be a semi-structured survey where you've got certain questions, but the researcher is allowed to go off script. Surveys come in lots of different guises. I remember working on a project in Yorkshire where they had a targeted survey. So they wanted to reach households which were digitally excluded. They knew the postcodes of those households, and they sent them a paper survey. So you can get quite creative, even just in the way that you deploy surveys. The other thing I wanted to say is that we tend to interchange surveys and questionnaires. So, what's the difference? Well, in short, a survey is an end-to-end process where you've got, say, a questionnaire and then the analysis, whereas a questionnaire is just the data collection instrument. So I make no apologies for the fact that those words we use quite a lot interchangeably. I am going to focus in on questionnaires specifically in terms of why surveys can go wrong. So just to set the scene for you a little bit there. So fundamentally, the good thing about surveys is they allow you to collect data in a standardized way. In other words, they are statistically reliable. You can run a survey one year. If you use the same questions the next year, you can compare apples and pears. I think the other reason why they are attractive is that people know how to respond. You put a survey in front of someone, they know that they've got to tick the boxes and answer the questions. So they are familiar, and that's really great. But what I want to focus on in this slide, at least, are the disadvantages. And I'll just talk you through those. So, number one is that it's a top-down approach. You've set the questions, but people may want to say something different. They may want to respond in a different way. And I often see certainly paper questionnaire responses with things scribbled on. You can imagine like a spoiled ballot paper. People write stuff outside of the boxes, and that causes a bit of a headache. But equally, you get questionnaires where there are missing questions, and that causes frustration. The second one there is about the design of that survey. You can actually introduce errors yourself. The one that springs to mind, the case that springs to mind, was a government consultation where they had the ability to limit online the number of words that someone could respond in a text box. And they actually clicked the button, restrict the number of characters. So you could enter about 3 characters and you were done. It just didn't work. The third one there is, this can happen depending on how smart you are. There is a temptation for people just to reach to the questionnaire and to fill it in without reading anything else. So what you get then is uninformed responses. And the trick here is to make sure that the consultation narrative doesn't get detached from the questionnaire. What some people do is they have some narrative, a chunk of narrative, and then they have a question, and then they have a chunk of narrative, and they have a question. And that's entirely possible, but then it kind of puts people off completing the questionnaire because they have to do the reading and they have to, it all gets drawn out. So there's no happy answer there unless you're absolutely sure that your narrative and questionnaire are together. Penultimate one there about data and sampling bias. This can happen unintentionally. So if you think about, I don't know, a library's closure consultation, I've been involved in one of those, and the consultor there accidentally put all of their questionnaires, all of their surveys in the library. So what should happen? Library members picked those up and they were the only ones to respond. And of course, they said they wanted to save the library. So immediately you've got sampling bias. And then finally, attention deficit. There is a temptation to make really, really long surveys and questionnaires. And people get so far and they get fed up and they drop out of the process. I've actually got a neat set of data about that phenomena on the next slide, on one of these slides later on, basically that says your survey should be ideally less than 5 minutes in duration. And if it's not, I would suggest that you probably need some kind of incentive to get people through the hump. So what's the other reason we've fallen in love again with surveys? Well, I think it's this. I think it's the fact that we've now got AI. So the evaluation burden of open-ended questions doesn't really exist anymore. So previously, you'd want a mix of the quantitative and the qualitative data, and I put the difference on the screen here. But the temptation was to restrict the open-ended text boxes because, well, actually, sometimes you kind of had to pay more from your third-party evaluator. But now we've got this functionality, we can be a bit more generous with the amount of qualitative data that we capture. So I think, again, a great reason why we should want to use more of this type of method. The other reason I think is flexibility. It's surprising how flexible we can get now with surveys. And, we've got these wonderful question types. We've got image picker, we've got map, pin in a map type questions. We've got skip logic, which helps people save time. And we've even got paper integration. So we can create something online, we can convert that to a paper copy, we can do the handwriting recognition. It's a lot slicker than it used to be. I've got a wonderful example here on the left of someone who's used a video narrative, and then they've gone on to use a sort of linear style question with emojis. And you can imagine that could flow from there to something like drop a pin in a map, an image picker. It really does start to become quite interactive. So online survey in particular, I would say, is a low cost method. It can save money. And if you really want to incentivize people to come from paper to online, you could say something like, well, actually, we're saving carbons as well. I can think of a consultation where someone has printed almost 300,000 surveys. You imagine, the waste, the paper waste, and the kind of pollution that causes. Let's move on. Let's look at effective design strategies. Let's look at some of the good practices. Here's that graph showing you how long people are willing to spend on responding to a consultation. Remember, I said most people less than 5 minutes. So be careful about the duration of your consultation surveys. But equally, it comes down to design and design stickiness. And I think the best reference here I've got is a discovery research paper from GDS back in 2016. I'll put the link for you here. That basically asked consultees, what do they need out of a survey? And they came up with a whole bunch of things. The important things are put in red. So the top one is really pertinent for me. The consultees said they wanted to see all the questions before starting to respond. What does that mean? Well, I think what they were trying to do is understand what the questions were so that they could go and think about them. Or maybe they were even representing an organization and they wanted to sub-consult, they wanted to consult people and then respond to the survey. So my tip for you here is maybe just create a PDF or a place where you just list all the questions in the survey separate from the survey. They wanted the ability to save answers and go back. That now exists in the GoVocal platform. They wanted the ability to have skip logic. That's to save time, and that exists. And they wanted the ability to seamlessly move through the questions and maybe go back and not answer them in a linear fashion. And in that respect, my advice there is maybe making questions mandatory is not a good tactic. Because if you make questions mandatory, you're forcing people to answer them before they can go back. So just a few things there coming out of that research, which I think can help us think about the design. As a side note, my other tip for you is if you're going to have a call to action, say you send out an email that says complete this survey, have one of the questions of the survey in that email. It's shown that creates intrigue, and it helps people understand what the questions are, but also go and complete the survey. So lots to think about just on this slide. Questionnaires have a flow. Think of them like a conversation. You want them to start easy and then to build up. And I would say, start with the essential or the key questions. A tip from me is to sort of talk through the questions and listen for natural pauses, and then create the pages. So do use page breaks, break up the questions into sets. Some organizations like the NHS, they have design patterns for this. They have literally one question per page. I think that's a little over the top, but it does reduce scrolling, I guess. I would just encourage you to keep each page to a single topic. At the end, I also encourage you to think about that as a reflection moment. So many people don't press submit, tell them that they need to press submit, maybe recap on the issues. I'd love it if our product showed you the answers you'd already made. Just think about that moment. And then after, when someone's pressed submit, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen a mock-up from GDS. I think we can tell people, you know, what happens next, and give them even more information. I'm very pleased to say we are going to be working on some survey improvements, so maybe we'll see some of these things a possibility in the next couple of weeks. If you've got a survey, it helps if you have some standing questions, and it might be that you want to create a template. In GoVocal, you can copy projects, so you could even have a shell that you copy over and over to use at a later date. But probably what you will want are these types of questions in there. You'll definitely want equalities monitoring. I suspect you will want a question along the lines of any other ideas or comments, because that demonstrates you have an open mind. And it might be you want a contacts email as well, so you can send people results if it's an open questionnaire. There's something else people are doing now. Some government agencies are including what we call a disclosure of responses statement. What that does is it reiterates your privacy policy, and that just helps people feel more comfortable when they respond to your survey. It also means that you can ask questions like this: would you like your response to be confidential? And this does two things. It guards against freedom of information requests that come in, but it also helps you determine, when you're writing your summary of results, your synthesis, you know, can I attribute this view with this person's name? And by the way, ordinarily I would say you don't do that for individuals, but it's absolutely necessary. If you get an organizational response, you say who said what. Information, also very important. You can see here on the left, I've actually ripped something from a real consultation that happened a few years ago in the north of England. Believe it or not, this is a map. I think the design agency went crazy here. Very difficult to tell that this is a coast, and these are locations of health facilities. This map was not drawn to scale, so again, it gave people some, you know, weird ideas about distances between those locations. So just be very careful when you present information. And it's not just written information, it's imagery. I tend to tell people to present options in a consultation and to use a SWOT format: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for each option. And you have to always say which options have been ruled out. And I would say you have to always declare your preferred option. So lots of things to think about just in presenting supporting information. We're also seeing a lot of fakes. This example here is someone on Facebook, I think it was, who was showing other people how to respond in a particular way. Very annoying. I call this a campaign response, and I think there's a 5-step strategy for dealing with this. Firstly, use registration. If you use registration, then people can only respond once in theory, unless they're very clever. Say that this kind of practice will be noticed and it won't be tolerated. Thirdly, to actually detect that this is going on. Fourthly, to analyze things carefully. If you get this happening, what you really want to do is separate out those campaign responses and do one analysis with them separate and one analysis with everything bundled together, so you can determine if it's made a difference. And that's, you know, really treating them as one response. So this gets worse when there's a fake organizational response as compared to a fake individual response. I think to help consultees, you can tell them how to respond effectively. There's a nice bit of text here on the left-hand side you could adopt. I really like this. It includes a sentence at the end there about selflessness, and that's because we get a lot of NIMBYs, you know, people who don't like things in their backyards and don't think about the bigger picture when they're responding. So maybe we can help people set the tone, set the mood, set the spirit of consultations. The second thing is really cool. It's on the right-hand side of this slide. We can use AI. I've asked it a question here. Were there any duplicate or near duplicate responses? So this is in the GoVocal system, and you can see beautifully that AI has trawled through those responses, and it's tried to, was given us some clues as to whether there was a campaign response. because these campaign responses are not necessarily all the same answers, they're permutations on the same. So do use that functionality to ask the AI a question. It can help reduce fake responses. Phew, okay, conscious of time. Top mistakes, how can we avoid them? Firstly, missing questions. I see a lot of consultations where people don't ask in what capacity you're responding. They don't ask a key question, and that is, do you agree or not with our proposals? And they don't ask the open-ended questions about any other ideas. A nice bit of case law I've highlighted on the right-hand side here from Sheffield, where they actually had a devolution consultation. They got sued by neighbouring Derbyshire, ironically, and the judge said, you know, the odd and conceptual nature of some of the questions has rendered parts of it unlawful. And that's because they asked a question which was a proxy for do you agree or not with the devolution, and it just became very horrible and unclear. Second thing is vague or misdirected questions. So this is really where people are asking the do nothing questions. It can't be influenced. You're asking a question which is really nothing to do with the consultation itself. It might be clouding the survey, but equally there's no effect as a result of you answering it. And I've got a nice example here from Lincolnshire Libraries where they asked about, again, closure of libraries, but they weren't specific. They were asking about tiers. You know, they categorized everything. So people were responding to that, getting very frustrated, not knowing if their local library was closing or not, because it wasn't relatable. So again, causing a lot of confusion and misdirection. You know, what's essential, what's not, rip out the non-essential stuff. Then you've got confusing or loading questions. Look at the top one. To what extent do you agree? It should be to what extent do you agree or disagree, right? And then the bottom example there is you've got two questions in one. So it's, again, very difficult to respond to that. A nice example on the right from a recent 2022 green paper about send, where it got criticized because people didn't understand what current remedies meant. People felt confused about how to respond to that particular question. It was a do nothing question anyway, and it just got people riled. So think about plain language. Think about making sure you're not loading those questions. Number 4 is when people add questions in which are really about satisfaction. And the trouble with asking these types of questions, you know, how easy was it to respond? How could we improve in the body of the consultation, is that you're setting yourself up for a fall. When people say they couldn't follow it, you know, suddenly you've kind of exposed the fact you've got malpractice. Equally, if you're going to use scales, use Likert scales. If you're going to use those scales, then at least have some semantic anchors where you tell people what the scale points are. You know, is 0 very bad? Is 10 excellent? You need to keep all that inside your questionnaire. Number 5 is inadequate equalities monitoring. You need to demonstrate that you've got due regard for the public sector equalities duty. That means typically having all these types of questions at the end of a questionnaire, which is what people tend to do. However, what I prefer to do is have a question like this. Do you feel adversely affected by the proposals? And if so, how? In the body of the questionnaire. And the reason I say that is because without a question like this, you can't update that initial equalities impact assessment very easily. So think carefully how you orchestrate your public sector equalities duty questions. At least make sure that they're in there. Number 6 is reporting. I'm pleased to say this is the last one, I think. People report their data poorly, so it's open to interpretation. You think about the use of percentages, you know, when you're responding, when you're reporting on a question. Actually, what you should have is something like this, this table here, where you're talking about the number of respondees, the percentage, the number that are valid, and so on, so that anyone who's reading the results, they get clear indication of what's happened. Pie charts, people go wrong with pie charts a lot because they have a yes, no, don't know. And if the yes is bigger than the no, the assumption is the answers people think yes. But if the don't know could eat into that no, then it could be a yes. So just be careful when you're presenting responses. Phew, okay. I've rattled through that, but I wanted to give you as much as in my brain as possible. I'm sure you'll be able to rewatch this or get a copy of the slides if you want to go over that deeper content. But I'm trying not to bore you because I know it's sunny outside. Laura, did we get any questions?
Thank you so much, Fraser, for that. It was super insightful. I at least learned a lot, so I hope it was helpful for our attendees as well. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I think one of them is around, you mentioned kind of setting the mood, setting the tone to encourage more kind of civil responses. Do you have any tips on how to set that tone, to set that mood in order to encourage residents to be, more civil, more open-minded when they respond to questionnaires or surveys?
Yeah, I would say firstly, absolutely state that your voice matters, that your views will be taken into account. I think it's helpful for people to understand the decision-making process and tell them, when there's a public meeting or when the decision maker will make a decision, who it is. I think it's quite neat to have what I call a consultation mandate. So that's really setting the scope and talking about what has and hasn't been decided, and hence what is and isn't up for influence.
Amazing, thank you. I would love to give you a minute to breathe, but unfortunately a few questions are coming in, so I'm just going to go through them. One person said, really interested in the open-ended equalities question. I find people get put off by long checklists of formal yes, no answers on different demographics. So do you find this open-ended approach helps to make it more meaningful?
I really do, because people will give you examples from their own lifestyle. They might be in a wheelchair, they'll start to explain. So they'll give you more context over those standard protected characteristics questions. And, in Scotland, we've got a question that also relates to socioeconomic status that we don't have in our standard 9 protected characteristics. So they might even talk about the fact that, they've got no money, they can't catch a bus to get to the library. And that's those are brilliant insights.
Amazing. And then Ellie is asking if you could give an example of a question where you ask about whether respondents agree or disagree. How do you ask this in one single question, please?
Okay, so this would be a key question, and it could be along the lines of, to what extent do you agree or disagree with our proposals? Or it might be with the proposal to X, and then you have a Likert scale underneath, like a 5-point scale from not at all to very much and everything in between. It might be, you've got to think about what point scale you want. So the reason you'd use a 5-point scale is that you've got a middle 0.3, which is neutral. You may not want people to choose a neutral. You may want a 4-point scale. But effectively, it's as simple as to what extent do you agree or disagree?
Perfect. Let me see. I think one just came up, by the way, Fraser. You can also see those questions on your end if you go on the Q&A, if you prefer reading them. I will still read them out so that everyone can hear them. Darren is saying that he's working on a consultation for a corporate procurement strategy, and he is trying to encourage responses from various parties, but he appreciates that the subject might be a little bit boring. Do you have any suggestion on how to hold engagement, as it can usually take around 15 or 20 minutes to get users through that, residents through that questionnaire?
Oh, tricky one, this, isn't it? And for me, it's always about impacts. So making sure you relay those positive, negative, intended, unintended impacts, and maybe even the consequences of not sharing your voice. If you don't get involved, then this might happen. I love, the use of video narratives, because you can really put a human face on a story, on a change, perhaps. And sometimes even quizzes or simulations can work, so people can educate themselves, because consultation is about education. The problem here is when you've got a really complex issue, how to relay complex issues to people. That's the hardest scenario.
Amazing. Thank you, Darren. I hope that was helpful. Another one coming from Pat. Any suggestions about ensuring that Oh, sorry if you're coming in at the same time, so I lost that. Any suggestions coming in about ensuring that they are getting informed responses, suggestions on how to ensure that those responses are not loaded or biased? I hope I read that out well. Got confused with a few questions coming in. Fraser, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, very difficult to understand whether a response is loaded or biased. I mean, you should be asking, what capacity you're responding. So it might be that when you're analyzing these things, you might analyze, say, staff responses who might be very biased compared to the general public. In terms of getting informed responses, you do see patterns. So some people call straight liners people who respond to a questionnaire like A, and then you know that someone's rushed through it. So if you can detect some of those patterns, you might know if someone's rushed it. Equally, I suppose you could time people, if you know that they've responded in 2 minutes compared to 10. Some people put in questions which are duplicated. So it might be the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like the decor? And then later on, it will be like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like the decor? And if the two questions match, then someone's being consistent. Informed responses really, that's just, I think really it's just about making that narrative as attractive as possible, and making sure that that questionnaire is somehow attached to the narrative. And in the questionnaire, it might even say, please refer to page 6 of the narrative.
Makes sense. But I hope this helped. If you feel like we haven't answered your question, please feel free to email us as well, and we can definitely get back to you with more information. Lots of questions coming in. Let's do a couple of more and then maybe wrap up and go and get some sun, all of us. So we've got one here about analysis. In terms of analyzing and presenting the data, would people not be put off by the number, percentage, number, that valid table, or do people normally respond well to this compared to pie charts?
What I tend to see is that there might be two audiences for a report. You might have a report that goes to a decision maker and a report that's for public consumption. So yes, moderate that. Otherwise, you can have, an executive summary and then the raw data in the back, which might be more verbose in terms of those raw numbers. But it frustrates me when that we're only, say, providing percentages and it's potentially misleading. So people are making judgments based on not seeing all of the data in its raw form. And yeah, I think it depends whether you're making one or more reports, but think about having that format, executive summary, detail coming later.
Lovely. Lovely. How do you strike the right balance when putting together questions that both allow community members to share their views on a proposal, but is also helpful, mindful for the organization receiving the feedback?
Ooh, I guess it comes down to your analysis plan and what the decision makers need to know. So you've got like a minimum set of data there, which is for a decision maker to take a decision. So there might be some stuff that you might feel is superfluous. You could have a branched survey where, if you say you're a member of staff, you go and complete one set of questions. If you say you're a community member, then it's slightly nuanced. So unfortunately, it's a problem we're kind of stuck with, that actually there's an awful lot to get through, and maybe just making questions optional. That's the way to allow people to move through a questionnaire quickly and to ignore the junk that might not be relevant.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. A few questions in the chat about what AI product we use and in what package it's included in our licenses. Please feel free to reach out via email and we can respond to those questions as well by email. Maybe just one more question for you, Fraser, coming from Darren again, who works on that corporate procurement strategy. He would like to ask members of the public, third sector organizations, elected representatives, and for the elected members, he would like the protection of registration to validate the response, but he doesn't want to put off members of the public. Is there a way to turn off depending on who is answering? I think that's either logic skip or two separate surveys.
Yeah, that could be that's smart thinking, Laura. Absolutely, you could do one with protection, one without. You can also have a kind of what we call light registration, whereby someone just needs to provide their email. They don't need to go through the full registration process. As long as they validated their email, they can respond to the questionnaire. I think the friction is quite low, really, in terms of registration. And remember, if people do register, then typically you'll get higher quality responses. So yeah, either what Laura said or use this hybrid, just your email validated and not the full registration process.
Darren, again, hope this helped, but do feel free to email us. I'll put my email address in the chat in a minute. If any of you have more specific questions about the AI tool, I saw a few come into the chat, which we haven't covered with Razor now. Do feel free to drop us a line. And either way, we will be in touch later in the week or early next week with the recording of the webinar. So that will also be an excellent opportunity to respond to that email with any additional questions that may come up between now and then. I think that's pretty much it in terms of the questions, Fraser. So going to give you a little bit of time back. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. It's been incredibly insightful. Thank you to all of our attendees. There were quite a few of you today, so thank you so much for taking time out of your day to attend this. I hope you found it useful, interesting, and again, we'll be in touch later this week, early next week with the recording, our details if you want to get in touch, have more questions, and so on. Enjoy the sun, and we'll see you for our next webinar at some point later this summer. Thank you.